Doctors of Reddit, what happened when you diagnosed a COVID-19 denier with COVID-19? A doctor here. I diagnose people with COVID on the daily. Some people are actually really great about it, others are more difficult. I'll tell you a tale that occurred during my most recent shift. Back-to-back rooms and patients. Patient A, in room #4, is a 23-year male, no medical history, comes in with body aches, malaise, and fatigue. Also had some mild nausea without abdominal pain or vomiting. Patient B, in room #5, is a 51-year female, medical history of intermittent asthma, so she uses a puffer infrequently, comes in with shortness of breath, has some possible fevers at home. In Trigid was noted that this patient's oxygen sats were in the 88 range and her heart rate wasn't elevated. Interestingly, when asked if she thought she had COVID, she said, "I can't have it. I tested negative 2 weeks ago when my son tested positive. He's been sick at home." You guessed it. Both people COVID plus. Patient A went home. He's doing great. Was extremely remorseful, and before he'd even left the ED he called his work to let them know he was positive and to get everyone there tested because he figured he had gotten the illness at work. He worked in a small family-owned warehouse as a foreman. He also called his parents and they were getting him set up to sleep in the garage until his quarantine was up. I respected this guy. Patient B got admitted to the hospital because her O2 sats weren't great. When I went back to tell her she was COVID plus, she called me a liar and told me I must have made a mistake. She threatened to sign out AMA against medical advice, but when she got up to leave she got so short of breath the nurse used that to convince her to stay. People are strange sometimes. I try not to let stuff bother me, but COVID deniers come very close to crossing that line. By the way guys, if you are enjoying this video so far, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It will help us out quite a bit, and if you don't enjoy the videos in the future anymore, you can always unsubscribe. Let's get back to the video. IQ nurse here, 6 years. Dealt with COVID since March 2020, actually had the first confirmed part at our hospital. November to February was rough. I had a 2-week streak where every day 1 or 2 of my patients would die. We'd go up to 3 or 4 patient assignments. The norm is 2:1 or 1:1F on certain equipment. Most all of the patients understood the severity of what they had. A handful didn't believe they had COVID, even though removing high flow O2 or their BiPAP would put their sats down into the 60s or 70s. Many had comorbidities that put them at risk: COPD/asthma, obesity/sleep apnea, smoking. I think people would refuse to be intubated because they knew what the outcome would be. Fight, hope, pray, fingers crossed, whatever you want to call it, delaying the inevitable. Our IQ attending would actually have them sign consent for intubation if they were cognizant enough to do so. Almost all of them died. Very few made it out alive, but still so sick and debilitated, some with trachis. One guy in particular sticks out. This was right after Christmas. 21 years old, HX1, obesity, sleep apnea, didn't like to take his insulin. Admitted with COVID. Didn't believe he had it. Should have been tubed days before but refused, then he ended up being intubated emergently. Took about 5 of us to prone him, lay him on his stomach, because his O2 sats were in the 60s. Couldn't get a pulse, noticed no waveform on the yard line. Had to flip him back over to do CPR for about an hour or so, before we called it. Had a kid and a fiance. Honestly, it was more of the families that denied their loved one had COVID. Upset, understandably, about not being able to visit. Zoom calls just don't cut it. I say this all as my parents, mom/SD and dad/SM, are all COVID deniers, even when I tell them what it's like. Well, those people had other things wrong with them though. They were older, they tell me. They send me links about all the conspiracy theories COVID. I got the Moderna in December and January, still haven't told them. It's awful. The facial swelling alone from being prone is enough to give a person nightmares. Watching someone go into multi-system organ failure, needing dialysis, unable to put them back onto their back, being maximumed out on ventilator settings and that still not being enough to the point of barotrauma, and collapsing a lung, and needing a chest tube to reinflate it. Families saying do everything, even though they had coded once or twice. Hearing families on Zoom crying, praying, singing as the patient is intubated, sedated, and paralyzed so the ventilator can do the work. Tearing up under all the PPE because yeah, we are still human. We work so hard and sometimes it doesn't matter. But we go back, day after day. I wish people who don't believe could see what I have seen. It might scare them enough to take precautions seriously and get the vaccine. I'm a student, funeral director, and I see families go to the funeral of someone who died of COVID-19 and still deny it. They started out shrieking at the doctors to change the cause of death on the death certificate. Now FEMA is helping with funeral expenses for covered deaths. Suddenly there's changes of heart. Physician here. The willful cognitive dissonance is real. It never ceases to amaze me how many patients will refuse assistance from me to register to get vaccinated, make claims that vaccines are harmful, but then accept my medical care on anything else that suits their whim. Patients absolutely have autonomy to refuse care, but why would you continue to see a physician and accept their medical advice and care if you think they would simultaneously recommend something to you that would be harmful? I've posed this question to patients who are vaccine hesitant. Why would you let me manage your diabetes and hypertension if you think I would harm you by recommending vaccinations? You cannot get any kind of thoughtful response aside from, I just don't want to be vaccinated. I assume lots of people get to their flat earth meetings using GPS directions. I never even thought of that. How do they think satellites work, if not in orbit around the earth? Did the Illuminati just randomly decide the sky doesn't have enough movement anymore with all the light pollution, let's add some more blinky lights on one-way tracks to go over the dome periodically? I'm an attending physician at our trade unit. On a Friday, an older gentleman, 60 plus years, came in with his entire family, wife, sister, Bill, 2 newts and 3 children, none of them with a face mask. All had mild COVID symptoms except him. He was saturating 80% with evident shortness of breath. We insisted in doing PCR and a chest CAT scan looking for COVID, but he and his wife refused, saying that COVID wasn't real and it was just a bacterial infection. The more we talked with him, the more agitated he got, to the point that his face was red. We suggested hospitalizing him to stabilize him and start treatment, but they accused us of exaggerating his symptoms and that we only wanted to hospitalize him so we could steal the liquid in his knees, a stupid rumor that was going around when this whole thing started. They both cursed at us and said they were going to a better hospital to get antibiotics. Fast forward 24 hours later on Saturday, we get a call from the hospital next county over telling us that they intubated one of our patients because he went into respiratory failure when he arrived, and they had to transfer him here because they don't have the appropriate equipment. We transfer the patient on Sunday, only to find out on the CAT scan he had 90% of lung damage. He passed away on Monday morning. Just before the family took the body away, I gave the widow the death certificate that I filled out, and before walking away, she turns around and waves the certificate yelling, "See? I told you it wasn't COVID." It says here, death due to pulmonary pneumonia due to SARS-CoV-2. I knew it was a bacteria. I told her, SARS-CoV-2 is COVID-19, ma'am. Edit, because everyone's asking what happened afterwards. Not much. She yelled, "No, it's SARS. It's a bacteria," and stormed off. It's actually one of the mildest encounters I've had with a grieving widow. Not a doctor, but when my grandmother was dying, my relatives kept pushing me and the doctors to say what it really was. It added so much stress to an already difficult situation and was embarrassing as well. Even after she died, they kept saying things like, "What if it was a stroke and she was misdiagnosed?" Don't you think they just didn't want to help her? I was trying to arrange with hospice to go in and say goodbye, and my stupid second cousin was sending me YouTube videos about how COVID is fake. I was already not close with these people, and I'm glad they are out of my life now. People apparently take YouTube and social media very seriously, don't they? Only if it reinforces beliefs they already had. Exactly this. I did my research simply means I searched for things that would confirm my pre-existing beliefs and ignored anything that didn't. Whenever anyone tells me I did my own research, I simply ask them where it was published after peer review. Because I specifically did not do my own research. I did, however, read the published, peer-reviewed studies based on the clinical research that actual scientists did. I'm a family doc who mostly does outpatient. I live in a pretty conservative area with a good proportion of covered deniers, so I've been seeing covered deniers since this mess became politicized. I've lost a few patients over the mask mandate. Anyway, I'm pretty pleased to say that several of my COVID denying patients have completely turned their attitude around when they, or a close family member, contracted COVID. Even if their case wasn't severe, the sudden terror that they could wind up on a ventilator overnight really puts the fear of God into people. Unfortunately, I still have some patients who are still pretty obnoxious despite their COVID diagnosis. They mostly dig in deeper into paranoia. If not about the virus itself, then about the circumstances surrounding them contracting it. If Fauci had done his job from the beginning, it never would have hit this town. It's the entire fault of Obamacare that I can't get the experimental immunoglobulin treatment. It's not. Your eligibility for the infusion is dependent on a list of risk factors, and, probably my favorite. So I have COVID, and it's completely your responsibility to fix it. I need you to send hydroxychloroquine, zinc, BD, lisinopril and azithromycin to the pharmacy, then they proceed to get at me when I don't. And yes, each of those things were actual things patients said to me after getting their diagnosis. I could probably think of more, but those were the most memorable ones. Not a doctor, but nurse that worked in one of our covered ICUs. Lady was intubated, sedated, pronounced. Therapy that involves lying the patient on their stomach in order to oxygenate the lung more effectively. Reserved for very sick COVID patients, the whole shebang. Miraculously she recovers and is weaned down to high flow nasal cannula, still a fairly high oxygen requirement, but better than needing the breathing tube. This spiteful she-devil would purposely cough on us nurses as we went into her room to give med/care, simultaneously yelling that COVID isn't real and that we gave her COVID got this winter sucked. I was hospitalized in the ICU for a while and wasn't far off from intubation myself. I was lucky and responded well to donor plasma and remdesivir and was able to recover surprisingly quickly once the pneumonia started clearing up. If it makes you feel any better, there are many more of us that considered you folk troopers and incredible. I made sure to thank each and every one of you every time they came in. From the multiple blood pulls, attempts at least, before I got my midline, the multitude of breathing treatments and shots, to having to balance my giant 6 feet 5 inch in the bathroom once I was able to walk enough to in an actual toilet. You guys saved my life, and I'll never forget it. So, something to consider when the behavior of these wear you down. Edit. Thanks for love, folks. One thing to add, the other thing that saved my life was quitting smoking 5 years prior to this. I weaned myself off with a vaporizer for about a year before dropping it entirely. Seriously, if you're smoking, quit, because it may bite you in sooner than you think. Not a doctor, but my cousin-in-law was a covered denier. Went to his covered denier girlfriend's family house for Thanksgiving without telling his parents that they were covered deniers. He was living with his parents, my wife's aunt and uncle, since he had recently divorced his wife. Got back and found out a week later that the whole girlfriend's family tested positive. He got it. So his parents both got it. His mother was in treatment for breast and his dad had asthma BTW, and they are not covered deniers. His mother recovered, but his dad, my wife's uncle, went from coughing and wheezing the day after Christmas to the ER on New Year's Day. Within 24 hours after that he was put on a ventilator. 3 weeks later he passed. So yeah, my covered denier cousin-in-law effectively killed my wife's uncle, and now that whole part of the family is really tense as his brothers kinda blame him for killing their dad, but their mom, wife's aunt, isn't willing to blame her son. Covered deniers. It's not really a joke. These are literally killing people through gross negligence and idiocy. My mother killed my aunt, her own sister, who was at risk, just to prove a point about covered supposedly being a hoax. It's the second relative that my mother killed. Now, mom thinks very highly of herself. She is very religious and believes she belongs in heaven and that I'm a heathen for being gay. Sure, I love someone of the same as me, but at least I didn't kill 2 people. I'm an emergency depth physician in the US. I work in an area that had the highest death rate for a solid couple weeks in the country. During our peak time, when we had national news crews here covering how we were saw numerous people screaming their covered disease wasn't real despite being hypoxic and on large amounts of oxygen due to COVID. That was an unpleasant time as this was still early May/June, and it was extremely political, like people apparently plotting to kidnap our state governor due to lockdowns. Saw a lot of people refusing COVID testing who needed admission for non-COVID purposes because the swabs would give them COVID or put some sort of tracking device. They weren't pleased when they then had to be admitted to our full-blown COVID floors. Our COVID floors resembled a war zone because they were understaffed and relative hole conditions as we basically converted hallways into COVID floors. Also saw a lot of people, young people who weren't exactly deniers, but thought you basically couldn't sick if you were young. Lots of people with their lungs permanently scarred, or at a minimum a couple weeks of misery and or spread it to their loved ones who got extremely ill. That last point. I'm early 40s. I wonder how many people my age will be dying early in 20 to 30 years from the long-term damage that a mild case of COVID did to their lungs and or body. I have treated a young male in our ICU with critical COVID-19 with severe diabetic ketoacidosis. He did not believe in insulin. Yes, you are reading this right, or other anti-diabetics, even though insulin is inexpensive in our country. He tried to treat his type 2 diabetes with herbs. His HbA1c, the lab value showing the state of his diabetes on the longer run, was off the roof. He did not vaccinate. He was offered, did not wear a mask, did not distance, and did not believe in any of this corona. Most of this information was obtained from his 20-year-old daughter, as he was quite disoriented at presentation and was intubated urgently. She was sobbing through the phone every day for 1.5 months until he died. I held the phone with his daughter on call to his ears multiple times when he was still intubated, but his mind cleared up and his sedation was optimal. I was quite convinced that he realized his mistake on the ventilator, with lines and tubes inserted into his body everywhere, and in his last clear moments, when his mind allowed, but I cannot be absolutely sure. I often think about the last conversation and last mental images people had before their death. I'm type 1. Getting COVID is a big fear of mine, and I assume many people's in this thread. Doctors and nurses have to defer to the patient for bar losers, which I almost always have to force their hand and make them contact my diabetes medical team. Being diabetic sucks, but not being in range is so much worse. The worst I've ever felt, for a long period of time, in my life was before diagnosis. My A1C was 11.5 mol, and I felt like someone was dragging me through mud with glass in it. Can't imagine DKA with COVID. I'm also a type 1, and I totally agree. Pre-diagnosis is essentially the closest experience to turning to stone I can imagine. I've explained having high blood sugar as having mud/glue flowing through your body too. Also, if you can, being a diabetic qualifies you for the vaccine in some countries now. I'm Canadian and got mine a week ago. Worth checking out. Stay strong. We diabetics gotta stick together. Not a doctor, but one of my university friends is a nurse in a COVID ward and has been since April 2020. She said she's lost count of how many people she's seen die while still denying COVID is real, or their families freak out at the healthcare workers and claim they are setting this up for the media. Super bizarre. One woman tested positive, but had mild symptoms. Because of her age and some other health issues, they wanted to put her on oxygen early as a precautionary measure. She refused and went home. She came back in less than 24 hours later super sick and unable to breathe. She said somebody must have injected her with chemicals from a Wuhan lab while she was at the hospital the day prior. But then she also said it was fake. Not sure how that works out. Anyway, she kept carrying on about how God was just allowing Satan to test her faith, and she would remain in the hospital, but not allow treatment. She allowed a saline forth, and then removed it, and claimed it was full of vaccine tests to eradicate white people. Then she demanded her family be allowed into the hospital and COVID ward without a mask. This carried on as she got sicker and sicker over about 48 hours. Before she slipped out of consciousness, the last words she said to my friend were, "You'll burn in hell for your part in this." She also had a story about a guy who had COVID twice and was in the hospital for over 3 months during 20 to 21. When the time period had passed since his second battle, she recommended he get the vaccine since he was clearly very susceptible to it. Keep in mind the first time he had it was mild, so he was still going around everywhere to buzz and out to eat. Places never closed here, it's super conservative, without a mask. Who knows how many people he passed it to? Anyway. His reply to her suggestion was, "Now why the f would I want to let those goddamn Chinese track me like that? I won't get something that isn't real. You almost died. I'm a security guard at a hospital. Some people get pretty aggressive when they get diagnosed, but I've mostly had problems with patients' families. Lots of people come in expecting to hang out in the exam room with the patient who already has a positive diagnosis and can get violent when they are turned away. I think I've said you can wait in your car, not in my building, more in the past 5 months than I could ever count. My family is full of deniers, and it doesn't matter how often I tell them about my nightly patrol that takes me through IQ, where I get to see nothing but fully geared medical staff and 90% minus 100% of capacity is COVID positive. They just tell me to quit, so I can stop being sad, rather than believe the virus is real. Friend of mine was a COVID non-believer. Another close friend of ours had COVID bad, and he gave him so much about not being online to game and hang out with us, and just slept all day to recover. His own mother got it twice, but each time they were mild cases. I believe he said that the second time she got it, she was sicker than the first time though. Then everyone including himself tested positive for COVID at his job. His was so bad it almost killed him. Found out he was diabetic too after his stay in the hospital. After he got out, he's still apologizing to our friend every time he sees him about downplaying COVID. Edit, looks like I missed a spot proofreading lol. Corrected part of a missing sentence. It's refreshing to read a case of someone realizing they were wrong and apologizing. Hopefully he will be one among many. I don't know if I could still be his friend anymore. I've cut loose at least 3 people since the start of this because they are just so ignorant and so selfish and such goddamn hypocrites that I lost all respect for them. They revealed themselves to really be heartless, stupid and I just flat out don't like them anymore. I would say that it's sad, but this is the end of the video. Thank you guys for staying with me till the end. If you enjoyed watching this, you might as well watch these too.